They couldn't beat you, so they decided to define you. They looked at your life, at everything you were building, everything you were becoming, and they felt something they didn't have words for. Not hate exactly, not jealousy exactly, something older than that. Something that lives in the chest and tightens when someone near you starts to rise without asking for permission. And so they talked, they whispered, they gathered in their little circles, and they told each other the story of you. Except it wasn't your story, it was their version. The version that made them feel safer, the version where you were smaller, the version where they were still the ones in control. And here is what they never understood. You weren't even in the race. You were never competing with them. You were never watching their scoreboard. You were never staying up at night calculating their moves or their opinions or their approval. You were somewhere else entirely, in the dark, in the quiet, doing the work that they never saw, becoming the person they couldn't explain. That's the part that broke them. Not your success, not your silence, not even your confidence. It was the fact that you won without ever entering their game. And to someone who has spent their entire life fighting for position, for status, for the approval of the room, someone who wins without competing is not just a threat, they are a mystery. And people fear what they cannot solve. So they tried to solve you the only way they knew how. They tried to reduce you. They called you lucky. They called you difficult. They whispered things about your past, about your failures, about the moments when you were broken and bleeding and barely standing. They took your lowest chapters and tried to make them your final sentence. They stood outside your story and decided they understood it better than you. Let that sit for a second. The person who never carried your weight thinks they know what broke you. The person who never sat in your silence thinks they understand your struggle. The person who has never built anything from nothing has a lot to say about how you built yours. No. That's not knowledge. That's noise. And deep down, you already knew the difference because you were there. You were there for all of it. You were there in the room when there was no applause. You were there at the table when it was just you and your doubt and the question of whether any of this would ever mean anything. You were there at 3 in the morning when the weight of everything you were trying to become felt heavier than anything you had ever carried. You were there and you stayed. That is not luck. That is not talent. That is not some accident of circumstance. That is a decision made over and over again in the dark with no witnesses to refuse to quit on yourself. And the people who never made that decision cannot explain what they see in you, so they explain it wrong. And you let them, because you don't need them to understand. You don't need anyone to accurately narrate a journey they were never invited into. You are not here to be understood by everyone. You are here to be faithful to something deeper than their comprehension. Now let me tell you something about the wound, because there was a wound. Don't pretend there wasn't. There was a moment, or maybe many moments, where what they said found a crack in your armor and got inside. Where the whispers got loud enough to echo in your own head, where you started to wonder if maybe they were right, if maybe you were too much, or not enough, or somehow fundamentally flawed in a way you hadn't yet discovered. That doubt is real, and it is brutal, and it is the part of this story that most people will never admit to. You sat with that doubt. You felt its weight. You looked in the mirror on the days when the reflection didn't feel like victory. It felt like evidence. Evidence that maybe you had failed in some fundamental way that couldn't be fixed or recovered from. Evidence that maybe the version of you they were describing was the true one, and everything else was performance. And in those moments, tick-tock, tick-tock, every second felt like a verdict being handed down. Every silence from the people who once supported you felt like confirmation. Every door that didn't open felt like the universe agreeing with your critics. That is the wound. That is what betrayal really is. Not the moment someone leaves, but the moment they're leaving makes you question whether you deserve to be stayed for in the first place. And I want you to hear this clearly. I want these words to land somewhere specific inside you. The wound was real, the pain was real, the confusion was real, and the fact that you felt it deeply, honestly, without shutting down, that is not weakness. That is proof that you were not hollow. That is proof that you cared. That is proof that underneath all the strength and all the silence and all the discipline, there was a human being who was breakable. And the most powerful thing a breakable person can do is break and then refuse to stay broken. Because something happened in you. In the middle of all that darkness, in the middle of all that noise, in the middle of all that doubt, something shifted. It wasn't a big moment. It wasn't a speech someone gave, or a quote you read, or a sudden flood of certainty that washed all the confusion away. It was quieter than that. It was smaller. It was a single thought, almost like a whisper from something deep inside you that said, "This is not where my story ends." Not said with triumph, not said with confidence, said with something more ancient than both, said with determination, the kind of determination that doesn't need to feel good, the kind that doesn't need celebrating, the kind that just refuses, that just decides in the quiet, with no fanfare, with no audience, that the narrative being written about you from the outside will not become the narrative you write about yourself. And that was the turn. That was the moment the story changed. Not when you became successful. Not when you got recognition. Not when the people who doubted you went quiet. The story changed when you decided, in the lowest moment with the least evidence, that you were still worth investing in, that your future was still worth showing up for, that the person you were becoming was worth every ounce of pain that the process required. That decision, that one quiet, unglamorous decision, was the beginning of everything. Now I want to talk about what happened after that decision. Because most people think the comeback is dramatic. Most people imagine it as this bold, visible, triumphant march back into the world. And sometimes it looks like that from the outside, but from the inside, from where you were standing, it was just work. Quiet, unglamorous, relentless work. It was waking up when the motivation wasn't there. It was doing the thing when the thing felt pointless. It was building when you couldn't yet see what you were building toward. It was discipline functioning as a replacement for certainty, because certainty was gone, but the work remained. And day by day, in the silence that everyone else mistook for absence, you were becoming. You were becoming leaner in what you tolerated. You were becoming sharper in what you pursued. You were becoming more honest, not in a harsh way, not in a defensive way, but in the way that only happens when someone has been stripped of their pretense and found out what was underneath. Found out that what was underneath was enough. Found out that the core of who they are is more durable than the narrative written about them. You were learning something that cannot be taught in rooms where comfort is prioritized. You were learning what you are made of when there is nothing left to rely on except yourself. Well, well, well. Look at who you were becoming in the dark and the discipline. Let's talk about the discipline, because that word gets used a lot and it gets used wrong. People say discipline like it means restriction, like it means punishment, like it means denying yourself comfort in order to earn the right to exist. But what you were doing, what happened in that rebuilding season, that wasn't punishment. That was precision. That was the methodical, deliberate, daily act of aligning your actions with the person you had decided to become. That was the practice of choosing every single day who you wanted to be over who the world was trying to convince you that you were. Every day you showed up to that, to the work, to the silence, to the process. You were casting a vote for the version of you that existed beyond their definition, a vote for the future that they didn't believe in, a vote for something that hadn't arrived yet but that you had already decided was real. And votes accumulate, slowly, quietly, invisibly, until one day the election is over and the results are in and there is no argument left to be made about who won. That's what was happening in your silence. That's what they couldn't see from where they were standing. They were watching the outside of a building and calling it abandoned. They didn't know that inside the foundation was being rebuilt, stronger this time, deeper this time, with materials that could not be shaken by the opinions of people who were never qualified to evaluate them. They thought your silence meant defeat. It meant construction. And I need you to understand something about that construction, because the version of you that comes out of a season like that is not the same as the version that went in. Something fundamental changes when a person survives something that was designed to end them. Something hardens, not in a cold way, not in a bitter way, but in the way that steel hardens under heat, the way stone is formed under pressure, the way something ordinary becomes extraordinary, not because it was lucky, but because it endured something that ordinary things don't survive. You came out of that season different. Changed in the places that matter, changed in the way you see yourself, changed in the way you respond to noise, changed in the things you give your energy to and the things you simply allow to pass by. Because you learned, really learned, in the way you only learn from experience, that most of the things that once shook you were never worth your attention. The opinions, the comparisons, the invisible scoreboard that other people were keeping about your life. The idea that you needed to be understood or accepted or validated by people who were not accountable to the same standard you were holding yourself to. You learned to let it go, not in a forced way, not in a performed way, in the way that happens when a thing genuinely loses its power over you. When you've been through enough to know that the noise was always just noise, and the only voice that ever truly had authority in your life was the one speaking from inside. Ha 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 ha. And that voice, that quiet, persistent, unshakable internal voice, it never once told you that you were finished. It never once agreed with the verdict they were delivering. Even when everything around you looked like evidence in their favor, even in those darkest moments, that voice held something, a thread, a refusal, a knowing that this was not the end of the sentence, just a comma in the middle of something much longer. Trust that voice, because it has never been wrong about you. Now let's talk about the people who couldn't stand to see it. Let's talk about them, not with bitterness, because bitterness is expensive and you've already paid too much, but with clarity, with the kind of honest understanding that doesn't need to be angry to be true. The people who couldn't stand you rising were never actually watching you. They were watching themselves. They were measuring their own life against the visible chapters of yours and finding the comparison painful. They were looking at what you were building and feeling something they didn't have language for, a mixture of admiration and envy and fear that arrived as hostility, because hostility is easier to express than vulnerability. Because saying, "I am afraid that your success reveals my own stagnation," is a level of honesty that most people are not equipped for. So they said other things. They said you were arrogant. They said you were cold. They said you were difficult or untrustworthy or somehow less than what you appeared to be. They constructed a version of you that was flawed enough to make them feel better about the distance between where you were going and where they were standing. And none of that was really about you. Every single word of it was about them. But here is what is interesting. Here is the part that most people miss. Their reaction to you, their inability to simply let you be, that was information. That was data about your trajectory. Because people don't try to diminish things that are irrelevant. People don't expend energy trying to define and dismiss something that poses no threat to their comfort. The ferocity of their reaction was a measurement of your momentum. The louder the noise, the more undeniable the movement. They were not responding to who you were in the past. They were responding to who you were becoming. And they felt it before you fully believed it yourself. So in a strange way, they were your earliest confirmation. Their resistance was the universe's first announcement that something real was happening, that the work was landing, that the becoming was visible, not to you yet, not fully, but to them. To the people who were paying close enough attention to feel threatened by it. Nah, let that really sink in. They confirmed your trajectory before your confidence had fully caught up with your calling. And now the distance has grown. Now the gap between where you were and where you are has become something they can no longer explain away with the old narratives. Now the work has compounded. Now the evidence has accumulated. Now the person they tried to reduce has become something they cannot reduce, and they are quiet now, or they are loud in a different way, the kind of loud that sounds like casual praise, but is really just an attempt to insert themselves into a story they tried to end. The sudden supporters, the people who remember knowing you, the ones who say, "I always believed in you," when you know that they were not the ones in the room when belief required something of them, and you let them. Because you are not in the business of keeping score. You are not cataloging who was there and who wasn't. You are not waiting to say, "I told you so," because that would require you to have been paying attention to them when you were supposed to be paying attention to your work. You were never watching them. That's the thing they still don't understand. You were never watching them. While they were watching you, you were watching something else, something further, something higher, something that most of the people in your life could not see yet because they were too focused on what was directly in front of them. You had your eyes on a destination that had not yet revealed itself to anyone else, and that singular focus, that commitment to a future that existed only in your discipline and your belief before it existed anywhere else. That is why you won. Not because you are exceptional in some abstract way. Not because you have gifts they don't have. But because you decided to serve what you were building with a consistency that most people are simply unwilling to sustain. You decided that the future you wanted was worth the present you had to endure. And you made that decision every single day, without applause, without an audience, without the promise that it would work out. That is not talent, that is character. And character is the one thing that cannot be stolen or borrowed or faked. It is built slowly in private, in the moments nobody sees. And you built it in all that silence, in all that pain, in all that rebuilding. You built something inside yourself that is now permanent, something that they cannot touch because it was never built for their approval in the first place. Something that exists completely independent of what anyone thinks or says or believes about you. You built an unshakable relationship with yourself, and that, in a world full of people who are still looking for external permission to believe in themselves, is the most radical thing a person can do. Now I want to talk about what this means going forward, because we have been talking about the past, the wound, the turn, the rebuilding, but what matters now is the future. What matters now is what you do with everything you have become. And here's what I want you to understand about that future. It is not a destination. It is not a moment of arrival where everything suddenly feels stable and certain and validated. It is a continuation of the same thing you have been doing, the same daily faithfulness to the work, the same discipline in the silence, the same refusal to let the outside world determine the inside narrative. It just looks different now, because now you know what you're capable of. Now you have evidence, real, earned, personal evidence, that you can survive things that were designed to stop you. Now you know what it feels like to be reduced and to refuse reduction. Now you know what it feels like to be defined by others and to choose to define yourself instead. That knowledge is yours. It cannot be taken. It cannot be forgotten. It cannot be argued away. It is part of the foundation now, part of what holds everything you're building above ground. And from this foundation, you build differently. You build with less fear because you have met fear and survived it. You build with less ego because you have learned that ego is a defense mechanism and you no longer need defending. You build with more patience because you have learned that the work compounds over time in ways that are not immediately visible. You build with more grace because you have learned that the people who tried to diminish you were suffering in ways you never saw. You build better. Not because you are better than them, because you are better than the version of yourself that needed their validation to feel whole. And here is something I need you to sit with. Something that might be the most important thing in everything I am saying to you today. The life you are living now, this version, this chapter, this season of clarity and strength and forward motion. This is not the reward for surviving the hard season. This is not the prize at the end of the race. This is the race. This is it. Every ordinary day that you show up as the person you have decided to be is the achievement. Every morning that you choose your values over your fears is the victory. Every moment you resist the pull toward smallness and stay committed to the larger version of who you are becoming, that is the win. Do not wait for some future moment to feel like you have arrived. You are here. You are present. You are becoming. That is not preparation for living. That is living. And it is extraordinary. And as you live it, as you continue forward in this version of yourself that has been built from both fire and discipline, you will notice something interesting. You will notice that the people who once couldn't stand you have one of two responses. Some of them will grow quiet, not because they have become your supporters, but because the narrative they were telling about you has simply run out of evidence. The story they were telling required a version of you that no longer exists. And when the story no longer fits the character, the story dies. And some of them, fewer, but they exist. Some of them will watch what you have become and feel something shift inside themselves. Not jealousy this time, something more honest than that. Some of them will look at your life, at the evidence of what a person can build when they refuse to be finished by their circumstances, and they will feel something that looks like inspiration. They will not always be able to say it out loud. They will not always come to you directly, but somewhere in their private moments, something in what you survived and how you built will reach them, will show them that it is possible. Will remind them that the hard season does not have to be the final one, and you will have given them something without knowing you gave it. You will have served them simply by being faithful to your own journey, simply by refusing to shrink, simply by doing the work in the dark and letting the light come when it comes. That is the kind of influence that cannot be manufactured. That is the kind of leadership that emerges only from genuine transformation, not from a stage, not from a platform, not from a curated presentation of strength, but from the actual, lived, earned reality of someone who went through something real and came out the other side still standing. That is who you are now. That is what you carry. And I want to say something directly to the version of you that still sometimes doubts. The version that still hears old voices in quiet moments. The version that still occasionally looks at how far you've come and wonders if it's enough, or wonders if it will hold, or wonders if the people who wrote you off back then might have been onto something after all. I want to speak to that part of you right now. They were wrong, not because I need to argue with them, not because I have a list of evidence to present, but because of this. Because a person who is as fundamentally flawed as they claimed you were does not rebuild, does not persist, does not sit in the dark and do the quiet work of becoming, does not show up every day with discipline that has no audience, does not carry the weight they described and still find a way forward. A broken